my name is Sheila Albertson, and welcome to my senior recital. It's titled Beethoven and His Interpreters, A Study on Moonlight Sonata. I will be playing piano, harpsichord, and vocal pieces for my recital. I will first begin with the main research, which is on the Moonlight Sonata. To begin, I'll give background information, then express the form in detail, as well as a breakdown of every movement, each of the three movements of the Moonlight Sonata. After that, I will provide details on different performers' styles and approaches to playing all three movements and how their approaches compare to my own interpretation of the three movements. So to start, the Moonlight Sonata is officially titled the Piano Sonata Opus 27 No. 2, Sonata Quasi una Fantasia, which translates to Sonata in the Manner of a Fantasia. The German music critic Ludwig Rellstab made a remark that the first movement reminded him of moonlight shining on Lake Lucerne, which this comment of his caught fire. Within the decade, publishers changed the name to Moonlight Sonata. Beethoven composed this composition in 1801 while in his early 30s when he started to lose his hearing. Some speculate that Beethoven wrote this piece for his 17-year-old piano student Giuliana Guiccardi, but it is much more likely his inspiration came from a darker place. Mozart's play Don Juan had a scene in which Don Juan kills the commander, and the melody from the first movement of Moonlight Sonata sounds very similar to that one in this scene. Rather than a romantic feel, this movement has a funeral feel, as some speculated coming from a death scene. A fantasia is free-flowing and improvisatory in nature, and this title sets the tone for the entire piece. The Moonlight Sonata is known for its mysterious, gently arpeggiated, and seemingly improvised first movement. Using arpeggios sequentially was a common improvisatory style of the time. The fantasy music genre is very improvisational, as can be seen through the many cadenza-like passages throughout the piece. This sonata inspired Chopin to write fantasy impromptu as a tribute to Beethoven. Now that we have some background information on the Moonlight Sonata, I would like to delve into the form. So the sonata of the classical period was written in three movements. Typically, the tempo for each movement went in the order fast, slow, fast. However, Beethoven breaks away from this tradition by creating the order slow, medium, fast, saving the most powerful movement for last. The three movements are Adagio sostenuto, Allegretto, and Presto agitato. The first movement, Adagio sostenuto, is quiet and somber. The entire movement's dynamics are in the piano or soft range. The movement's lack of forte is restrained for Beethoven, as most of his works nearing the end of his life are loud and exuberant. The triplet ostenuto rhythms continue throughout the movement. When the melody arises in the piece, it is fleeting and sparse. It practically glistens, like light peeking through the darkness. The first movement's form is in typical sonata form, with an exposition, a short development, a recapitulation, and a coda. It has cadenza-style passages, mimicking an improvisatory style. The first movement is in C-sharp minor, the second movement is in the parallel major of D-flat major, and the third returns back to C-sharp minor. And D-flat and C-sharp are in harmonic, as they're the same note on the piano, but suggestive of different keys. Bringing out the top note and making the inner notes softer is essential to playing the first movement properly. By doing so, the melody line can shine while the inner notes are there to provide texture. Using the body to move with the hands is a vital step of playing any piece well, and the right hand arpeggiates up a scale in the development section of the first movement, which requires I move my body as I'm moving my hand as well. The second movement is a minuetto and trio. Minuets were written to be danced to. The definition of a minuet, it has 3 beats in a bar and generally moves along at a leisurely pace. Composers as far back as Jean-Baptiste Lully wrote them for the courts of kings and queens, where wealthy and upper-class people would gather to indulge in fine food and drink, strive to make a good impression on the ruling monarchy, or simply make sure they were seen in the right places. The trio element evolved as a technique to make the minuet last longer, and is simply another minuet stuck in the middle. Composers helped audiences identify the trio by scoring it for 3 instruments only, and that's where the name trio comes from. The basic minuet form is minuet trio minuet, or ABA form. So as I mentioned, the second movement is much shorter than the first movement. It's like a dance. It is very playful in nature. If the first movement is like a beginner level or easy level, the second movement would be considered a little more challenging technically, in that there are many details that, even though it's a short piece, it is very detail oriented. I've also learned to use legato while holding down 2 notes, which extends the time the top note is played. In the second section of the second movement, there are octave leaps in the right hand in the trio part, which I've learned to bounce with my body for the sforzandos. Again, using the body here is important as it affects the overall sound. And lastly, the third movement is the most difficult technically. It has a dark and heavy and angry sound. It's similar in mood to the first movement, but it's much faster and ferocious. The powerful sound in this movement comes from a few bursts of sforzandos, but most of the piece is in piano. It just has loud bursts all of a sudden that make it very powerful. Beethoven placed the most important final stormy movement in the last movement. This movement, as what Charles Rosen said, is the most unbridled in its representation of emotion. Even today, 200 years later, its ferocity is astonishing. The writing of this movement contains lots of strongly accented notes and dynamic changes. Beethoven used crescendo a lot to move the passage from piano to fortissimo and to create the sense of a very powerful sound. So now that I've discussed the Moonlight Sonata in great detail, I would like to discuss interpreters and my own interpretation of each movement. So to start, I wanted to talk about my personal interpretation of the first movement. I play this first movement at a medium to fast tempo in comparison to other artists that I've heard. And when I play, I try to bring out the top note as much as possible. I've learned through my coaching that the middle notes and the rhythmic ostenutos are not as important than are the top notes. I try to keep a consistent rhythm, and if I do fluctuate within the piece as far as my rhythm, I try to maintain that fluctuation consistently throughout the piece. One artist who does this nicely is performer Steven Kovacevic, who has a slower tempo but maintains consistency when he slows down. I try to play each phrase musically and start off soft and quiet and get louder, but all the while keeping a soft dynamic marking the whole piece. Radu Lupu is a Romanian pianist who plays this first movement. He plays this first movement at a slower pace with a somber tone, slowing down significantly at the end of the phrase. He takes a lot of time to play the melody line. This first movement generally has a sadder feeling, and the slower tempo and rubato brings out that feeling even more, I feel. He takes lots of time and freedom in this first movement, and when I first heard it played really slow, I almost did not like it, but because as I kept listening, I was waiting for the piece to move forward, but it felt as though it was held back. When it felt like I was walking through mud listening to it, if it was too slow. So during the cadenza in the development section, the performer lingers on the top of the arpeggio. He moves up and then lingers on the last note and then comes back down the scale, bringing out the bottom notes after the cadenza. And this had a really somber effect. Overall, Lupu slowed down a little too much in this movement for my preference. And so that's why I think I personally played a little faster. So the next interpreter that I watched, his name is Geza Anda, who's a Swiss-Hungarian pianist. In the first movement, he plays at a nice pace and he really brings out the melody line, and I like how he brings out this melody with consistency throughout the movement from start to finish. I realize personally I don't like this movement played super slow, as I mentioned before. I prefer it moving, and when the melody line is really coming out, that helps me pay attention to it more. Stephen Kovacevic is an American classical pianist and conductor. He plays the opening phrase of this first movement beautifully, shaping it with perfect timing and dynamic range. He does play this first movement on the slower side, but I actually enjoyed his performance because he was consistent with his the way he slowed down. At the end of a phrase, he would do the same exact rhythm, and so as a listener, I really appreciated that, and I thought that his consistency made the slower tempo more meditative and reflective, and I appreciated that. And it was very beautiful when he took his time at the end of each phrase, and he also brung out the lower notes in the left hand really nicely. So from these different performers, you can see how my interpretation of the first movement was formed. So in the second and third movements, I want to move on to those two and discuss how I interpret them in comparison to other artists. My interpretation of the second movement, I try to play the second movement more upbeat and fast, like a dance. I noticed some performers don't do this, but because it is a dance, I try to get in like more of an upbeat feel, and I try to move my body with the music as well. I try to bring out the melody line, which switches between left and right hands, and I attempt to make every section have a different tone or quality, demonstrating the unique feel of each section in the third movement because the emotions are changing a lot and it's a very emotional movement. I try to contrast each section and bring out the different nuances of each section. One performance that really stuck out to me on YouTube was by a female performer. Her name was Valentina Lisista. She is a Ukrainian-American pianist, and she brings out the melody line and the minuet part of the second movement, letting it ring nice and bright amidst the moving parts in the inner and outer notes. She slows down to close the second movement, which is nice, then gets right into the third movement abruptly with a new ferocity and approach. Lisista plays the third movement at a very fast pace and plays it from memory perfectly, which I find extremely impressive. She has complete control over her hand movements, and she does not lose her speed or stamina at all. That's something as a performer I struggled with, losing my speed and maintaining that consistent pace throughout the piece, and she does that very well. And has a lot of strength and consistency in her playing. Next, Alfred Brendel is an Austrian pianist, poet, and author, known especially for his performances of Beethoven. He plays the second movement at a slower tempo than I do. In the trio, he really brings out the bottom sforzandos in the left hand. And I noticed how each artist brought out different notes. Like, they focused on phrasing and shaping. If a note was played multiple times in a row, they would play it a little differently every time. And I appreciated Alfred Brendel's stylistic choices as far as which notes he brought out and which ones he did not. I liked his pause at the end of the minuet section, and his transition into the third movement was very wow to me. He just ended the second movement on a lighthearted note and then went right into the third movement, which is just very crazy and chaotic. And I felt that his techniques and dynamics in the third movement were unique. I particularly enjoyed his second movement as it had nice dynamic range, and it sounded smooth and legato, which I try to implement in my piano playing as well. And he phrases everything consistently, which is something I also try to do. And when Alfred Brendel plays the third movement, he builds up when the dynamics get louder, and it sounds to me like an ocean wave crashing down. And the dramatic increase in sound makes a powerful effect. I like the contrast between the second and third movement tempos. He played the second movement slow and peacefully, and the third movement completely contrasted. And as a listener, I really appreciated this and took it by surprise. The next artist I listened to was Glenn Gould. He's a Canadian pianist who became one of the best known and most celebrated classical pianists of the 20th century. Glenn Gould plays all three movements at an impossibly fast tempo. It's the fastest recording I've heard of all three movements in just 10 minutes. Most people play all three movements between 15 to 20 minutes. As I said, there's no right or wrong when it comes to playing tempos, but he plays it the fastest, but it does not necessarily make him the better artist. Playing it faster is in no means a mark of someone playing it better, but a mark of someone's personal preference and style. And I noticed how I preferred the second movement to be played at a faster tempo than a slower tempo. I've noticed that in my own personal preference, if a piece or if a movement moves too slowly, it loses its momentum and it drags on a little bit. The choice to play the entire three movements fast does not provide a contrast to the three movements as Alfred Brendel does. He contrasts his movements. The second movement he plays slow, the third movement he plays fast, and I really took that contrast by surprise, while Glenn Gould just plays all three movements really fast. But it is impressive to see the skill and ferocity and the capacity he has to play at that speed. But one thing I did find in common with all the artists I did listen to was that no matter what, they all brought out the melody lines. And so I could clearly hear the melody ringing amidst the other harmonies and other things your hands are doing that are just providing texture. And consistency is really important no matter what the performer chooses to do as far as tempo and as far as dynamic markings. Another performer I listened to was Arthur Rubinstein. He's a Polish-American classical pianist. He plays the second and third movements very straightforward compared to like other artists like Alfred Brendel. But even though he is straightforward, he has nice dynamics in the trio part of the second movement, adjusting from forte to pianissimo. The octaves in the left hand sound nice like a rumbling thunder. He approaches these two movements at a more consistently slower tempo, which is more reachable for me as a performer, so I could look up to Arthur Rubinstein more than I could Glenn Gould. And he takes a nice breath of air in between the second and third movements, unlike Alfred Brendel, who dives right into the third movement and surprises the listener. His trills, Rubinstein's trills, are crisp and accurate. Again, he has a very straightforward playing, and although I hear nothing like out of the ordinary, I do appreciate like the directness that he plays it with. So that is my research for the Moonlight Sonata. Next, you will hear me play those three movements, and I hope that with the information you heard me discuss, you can apply it to what you're hearing and enjoy. Thank you so much. Danzas Argentinas by Alberto Ginastera was composed during Ginastera's first period in 1937 to reflect objective nationalism. The title of the work is nationalistic in nature, titled Argentinian Dances. These titles are indicative of the different types of dances performed from various regions of Argentina. Each movement is in 6/8 time, and each dance has a different tempo marking. It goes fast, slow, fast. So the first movement is Danza del Viejo Boyero, or Dance of the Old Herdsman. Second movement is Danza de la Moza Donosa, Dance of the Beautiful Maiden. And the third movement is Danza del Gaucho Matrero, Dance of the Outlaw Cowboy. So the first movement, titled Dance of the Old Herdsman, has syncopated and horse-like rhythms, similar to a man herding cattle on horseback. The piece is in a bitonal mode, meaning the right hand is in E Phrygian, which is in the key of C major, and the left hand is playing the pentatonic scale in D flat major. So the left hand has 5 flats, the right hand has no sharps or flats. Performing the first movement, I keep a dance-like quality in my body motions, as it is a very playful movement. And it is organized around the middle climax portion of this piece, measures 34 to 45, that incorporates both A and B themes. In the first A section, the rhythm is jumpy, and the left hand is replicating the strings of a guitar, while the right hand chords are sparse and have 2 variations. The B section has the left hand playing 6 notes and the right hand sparsely playing the chord. At the very end of the piece, the left hand plays a 6-note chord that is replicating the strings of a guitar: E, A, D, G, B, E, like plucking the strings of a guitar. The first movement ends on the note E, which is the tonic of the Phrygian scale and the lowest string note on the guitar. The second movement is Ginastera's most well-known movement. It is titled Dance of the Beautiful Maiden, indicative of a beautiful maiden dancing. In this second movement, I pay attention to phrasing the right hand melody and keeping the left hand as soft and piano as possible. The second movement is in 3-part ABA form. The A section starts slow, delicate, and soft. The B section starts in 2-note intervals and gradually enters full octaves, gathering in intensity and loudness. The A section returns softly after and is very beautiful and melodic. The third movement is titled Dance of the Cunning Gaucho and starts off at a high tempo. This movement has interesting syncopated rhythms and is technically the most challenging of the 3 movements. This movement begins with the A section moving quickly and quietly. In the B section, I focus on bringing out the top note in the triad, since the left hand is moving a lot and otherwise it sounds busy and strained. In the C movement, I can really hear the Argentine influence, and dance-like structures come into play. This feeling of syncopated rhythm and jolts from the first movement comes back in the third movement. The piece ends with dynamic quadruple fortes and tremendous glissando to bring the dance to a close. My sister made an observation when she heard me playing these 3 movements that the third movement sounds very chaotic, and she guessed that it must have symbolized the nationalism of Argentina, or maybe they were having revolutions, or some chaos was going on in the country, as the third movement and the first movement are both very chaotic in nature. But it's interesting, as the second movement is very peaceful and beautiful. It almost sounds like it doesn't even belong in that set. But I think that's why most people are more attracted to the second movement. So with all that being said, I hope you all enjoy my playing of Danzas Argentinas by Alberto Ginastera. For my recital, I will be performing 2 harpsichord pieces, the first of which is the Chaconne from the Suite in A minor by Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. De la Guerre was a French musician, harpsichordist, and composer born in Paris in 1665 and died in 1729. The Suite in A minor has 9 parts, the 7th of which is Chaconne, which was written in 1687 in Paris. This piece implements a style called notes inégales, and it refers to a performance practice mainly from the Baroque and classical music eras. This means to swing the rhythm, so rather than playing the 8th notes straight, you swing every other note. However, once the piece enters the 3rd couplet, 16th notes are introduced, and the rhythm is played straight from that point on. So the notas inégales is only for when there are 8th notes. The Chaconne begins with a refrain that gets repeated numerous times throughout the piece. The refrain is very majestic and royal in its quality and in its character. I would say that each time I play the refrain, I try to play it a little differently with a slightly different character. The couplets in themselves also have their own character, I would say. So make sure to listen for those slight changes. And the first 2 couplets are in swing rhythm with 8th notes, and the second 2 couplets are straight rhythm because they're incorporating both 8th and 16th notes. There are numerous accentals in this Baroque style of music. Trills are placed on every other note, and it is proper form to approach the trill from the note above. The grace notes are meant to be played with more emphasis than in classical music, where the grace note is supposed to be short and quick. Hence the differences in technique between classical piano and Baroque harpsichord. It's complete, even though they both have keyboards, the approach and the techniques are very different, as well as the touch. The second harpsichord piece I will be performing is Les Baricades Misterieses by Francois Couperin. This is a French composer and a French name, which translates to the mysterious barricades. Couperin composed this for harpsichord in 1717. The style of piece, unlike the Chaconne that has notes inégales, this style is style brise, which is characteristic of French Baroque keyboard music. And this work is in rondo form, in 4 parts, creating an ever-changing tapestry of melody and harmony, interacting and overlapping with different rhythmic schemes and melodies. Unlike the Chaconne that is in swing rhythm, Les Barricades is in style brise, or broken style. This style has many chords broken up, and the notes are held down while other notes are played over it. It is also known as lute style, as a musician plucking the strings of a lute one by one. Similar to the Chaconne, this piece has a refrain which gets repeated many times in between the couplets. There are 3 couplets, each one of which has 3 phrases. And you can hear for these phrases, when you hear me slowing down, that means I'm coming to an end of a phrase or beginning to start a new phrase. And in order to play this piece without it sounding too repetitive, it is important to have consistent phrasing. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. For my senior recital, I will be performing 3 vocal pieces. The first one is Selve Amiche by Antonio Caldara. Antonio Caldara was an Italian Baroque composer. He worked as a chorister at St. Mark's in Venice. He later worked for Mantua from 1699 to 1707, and then in 1707 in Barcelona as the chamber composer for Charles III. His success stemmed mainly from his vocal music. His other works included operas, such as Sofonisba and Tito y Berenice, and oratorios, such as Santo Stefano and Maddalena, and other works such as Alma del Core and Crucifixus, which were solo works. Selve Amiche, which is the piece I will be performing, is an art song aria, and it was written in the early 18th century. The original text is in Italian, but the translation reads as such. Friendly woods, shady plants, loyal shelter for my heart. This loving soul asks from you some peace for my grief. After Selve Amiche, I will be performing Wouldn't It Be Loverly by Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewe. This piece was written for the 1956 Broadway play My Fair Lady. This song is sung by flower girl Eliza Doolittle and her street friends. The stage version was sung by Julie Andrews. Loewe was an Austrian-American composer. He collaborated with Lerner on a series of Broadway musicals including My Fair Lady, Camelot, and Gigi. Lerner was an American lyricist and librettist. Lerner and Lowe's first hit was Brigadoon. And Lerner worked with Kurt Weill on stage musical Love Life, and worked with Burton Lane on the movie musical Royal Wedding. The story of My Fair Lady is about Eliza Doolittle, a Cockney flower girl, who takes speech lessons from Professor Henry Higgins, a phonetician, so that she may pass as a lady. The original Broadway and London show starred Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews. The song Wouldn't It Be Loverly was performed early in Act 1, soon after Eliza meets Higgins. Eliza and her friends wonder what it would be like to live a comfortable life. Lastly, I'll be performing Someone to Watch Over Me by George Gershwin. Gershwin is an American composer and pianist who composes pieces both in pop and classical music genres. Among some of his famous pieces include Rhapsody in Blue, Fascinating Rhythm, I Got Rhythm, the opera Porgy and Bess, and Summertime. Gershwin was born in Brooklyn, New York, and started his career in music as a song plugger at first. Gershwin wrote the piece Someone to Watch Over Me for singer Gertrude Lawrence in the musical OK in 1926. Someone to Watch Over Me was recorded by Frank Sinatra in 1946 for his first album. Ella Fitzgerald recorded this piece in 1951. The context of this piece is in the play is the girl singing to her rag doll asking for someone to watch over her. And with that, I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
has